days when we did our general court and U.S. history on the top, and then we did a day of 14th Amendment, and then we did a day of First Amendment. She has corrected this to 1915, the mutual film case. She's got her quartet. She's got her 3 legal milestones from 1925, nicely lined up.
Can you print this out?
Do you mind?
What?
Can I share it with you?
Oh, yeah.
But remember that this is only through those classes through the end of the week that was called the First Amendment. We got up through the milestones. And then, of course, here we continue on with the turn of the 1930s, the 3 legal milestones of the 1930s, which are
Oh,
no, that's 25. The 3 legal milestones of the 1930s. Near, Grosjean, and Lavelle. Right? Near 1931, Grosjean 1936, and Lavelle v. City of Griffin 1938. So the way to think about these things is the same way when we did the 3 legal milestones of 1925. Think about what are the milestones. The Judiciary Act, what was the significance? It created certiorari, created the modern Supreme Court. The court could pick and choose. Pierce v. Society of Sisters, it was on our 14th Amendment timeline. What's the significance?
First time you protect people.
Supreme Court starts to use substantive due process under the 14th Amendment to protect people rather than corporations. Birth of the modern 14th Amendment. And then on our First Amendment timeline, Gitlin v. New York. No, it doesn't incorporate the word liberty. What does it incorporate? It incorporates parts of the Bill of Rights. And what was the part?
The word liberty and due process.
No. What is it incorporating? It's incorporating something into the word liberty. It's not incorporating the word liberty. It's incorporating freedom of speech into the word liberty in the due process clause of the 14th Amendment in order to reach down to the state and local level, right? It's not, you're not incorporating the word liberty. You're incorporating parts of the Bill of Rights into the word liberty in order to reach down to the state and local level. Starts the incorporation movement, starts the reach of the First Amendment down to the state and local level. Now the word Congress, in Congress shall make no law, means what? This reinterpretation. Any agent or entity of government at any level. Right? Birth of the modern First Amendment. So that's the way you chunk things together as you're studying. So then you move on to 1930. You say 3 legal milestones of the 1930s. 1931 gives us Near v. Minnesota. What's the significance of Near? It gives us the Near rule, which says
that publications, or the 3 things are that the publications are obscene.
no. What's the Near rule? Prior restraints are almost always unconstitutional. Almost always tells you that there are exceptions. How many of the exceptions? 3. Publications that are obscene. Publications that threaten to incite violence and or the violent overthrow of government. And 3, threaten national security. So you just reverse like that. 1936, the court made an analogy. It said that taxes also can be like a prior restraint, Grosjean, and in 36, the court said anything that smacks of a licensing scheme is like a prior restraint, Lavelle v. City of Griffin. And Lavelle v. City of Griffin also told us something important, right? Freedom of the press is a fundamental personal right. That gives us number 3 in our 3 bedrock principles of First Amendment law.
First Amendment rights are not absolute. Government bears to rule truth, and freedom of the press is a fundamental personal right, not a constitutional.
Getting your lines crossed. But the 3 bedrock principles of First Amendment jurisprudence. First Amendment protection is not absolute. The First Amendment is not
A shield against laws in general.
And number 3, freedom of the press is a fundamental personal right, not an institution. So teach me something. Tell me how you should study for the exam. Who started studying? Good. Together is part of it. You've got to study with somebody else. It's not a good idea to try to do this alone. But so one way you could start, what did you tell me about doing this?
Like rewriting it really helps.
Rewriting it really helps. Go through your notes and make yourself, you don't have to do it this fancy. It's nice. It's going to make you read. So, but taking the time to do it is active learning. Go into your notes where you wrote this stuff down the first time and maybe it's not very neat, and make a neat version of it. Just the act of writing it down will help you internalize.
When we went over the format of the test, didn't you say it was going to be just case, and break down the case into terms and reasoning?
Well, there's going to be multiple choice questions and then a series of short answer questions. And so what types of things do you think would come up?
The background of the First Amendment, maybe, how it led to the modern version? I don't know.
Maybe some of that, some of our discussion about the First Amendment and where it came from.
Or the forms we've been doing? I don't know. Guessing.
What forms?
The ladder, step ladders.
Those seem really important. We spent a whole week on those, right? And we made those elaborate visualizations. So I would definitely say that anything that we did, like charts, timelines. What else? What else should, as you go through your notes, what should your eye be looking for?
What about your voice of God through these?
That's a big hint. So, a lot of those lists, you like lists? The 3 legal milestones of 1925, the 3 legal milestones of the 1930s, 3 bedrock principles of First Amendment jurisprudence. What else? You got the 3-part strict scrutiny test. That's another 3, right? Does the government have a compelling interest to regulate this speech? Does the regulation in question accomplish that goal? 3, is the regulation narrowly tailored so as not to squelch too much speech? We had 3 levels of scrutiny. What's the top? Strict scrutiny. Strict in theory, fatal in fact. Whenever the court applies strict scrutiny, it's about to strike down a law as unconstitutional. What is the process called by which the Supreme Court strikes down a law as unconstitutional? Judicial review, which comes from what case? Marbury v. Madison. What year? 1803. When the court uses its power of judicial review to strike down a law as unconstitutional, that is an example of judicial activism. So what we're getting at here is look for terms of art. Their definitions. You want to try to get the definitions as close as possible. That's why I say things the same way each and every time. Say, and cases, if any. So, for example, if I said freedom of the press is a fundamental personal right, the case that supports your answer is Lavelle.
I have 2 questions. First of all, like a short answer. So, like, if you said, what is the stair steps or types of detention? If we like wrote the stair steps out and did that, is that okay, or does it have to be in paragraph form?
I don't want anything in paragraph form, really. So, because this is not, it's not an English class, and so you don't, in law, you want to just be as boring as possible. And so if I ask you to tell me 3 bedrock principles of First Amendment protection, you just do them.
Just like
Boom, boom,
list
boom.
them
Yeah, just list them. You know, and if I say, freedom of freedom of the press is a fundamental personal right, cite a case to support your answer, you just cite Lavelle. You could just use the pet names, you don't have to use the whole thing. You don't have to know all those dates, but I find that if you go ahead and learn the dates as you do them, it helps you keep them in order, right? Because law is inherently historical, right? It runs and we want to see how the law develops over time. And so if you learn the dates, it'll help you keep them all in order. So it would help you know not to talk about, near before talking about Gitlow, because Gitlow is 25 and Near is 31. It would help you remember not to talk about Pentagon Papers case before you talk about Near, because Near is 31 and Pentagon Papers is 71. Now, Mr. Winter, after Near, you get the Pentagon Papers case of 1971. It's significant because it adds 3 more rules. Rule
Right.
1.
Courts will presume.
Courts will presume a prior restraint is unconstitutional.
Government bears burden of proof.
Government bears the whole burden of proof. And 3,
In national security cases, publication must threaten direct, immediate, to irreparable harm to the nation or its people.
right, so that if the government is going to be tempted to try to use national security as an excuse, in other words, they're modifying the 3rd prong of Near, and they're making it much harder by raising the bar and saying you must prove direct, immediate, and irreparable harm. And so then if I ask you, what's the relationship between that holding in the Pentagon Papers case and the court's holding in Brandenburg v. Ohio from 1969? Or the RAB case, or Virginia v. Black? What's the relationship between those cases? That would have been a good exam question. I shouldn't have burned that up. What's the relationship between Brandenburg, Pentagon Papers case, RAB, and Virginia v. Black? What do they all have in common?
Oh, Brandenburg had to do with incitement.
Right, and what did it do? It raised the bar. What did RAB do? It raised the bar on fighting words doctrine. And what did Virginia v. Black do? Raised the bar on true threats doctrine. So in each case, they are all cases in which the Supreme Court is making it harder and harder and harder for the government to suppress your speech or your press right. Right? I'm going to have to use that next time. Don't tell anyone. What else? So you want to be looking for terms and definitions and lumping things together. Try to, as often as possible, attach a case to a rule. If I said, what is state action doctrine? What is state action doctrine?
There has to be government involvement in order for it to be a First Amendment case.
Okay, that's the significance on the First Amendment level, but what about other types of constitutional claims?
Unless government involved.
Can't be made. So the doctrine is, without government involvement, no constitutional claim can be made, and the significance in First Amendment law, as Mr. Bailey points out, is that the First Amendment doesn't reach private actors. You can't have a First Amendment claim between 2 private people. It has to be the government trying to suppress your speech or press rights. And what case do you cite to support your answer? Civil rights cases of 1883. And that's how you do it. Clump things together that go together. Right? Or if we were talking about incorporation, you would attach Gitlow to support your answer. What substantive due process? The process by which the court, no, substantive due process, as distinct from incorporation. There's a very important difference. Substantive due process is the process by which the court gives new meaning or substance, even a mental trick to bring those 2 things together. Substantive due process is the process by which the court adds substance or new meaning to the word liberty in the due process clause of the 14th Amendment. That's it. It has nothing to do with reaching down to the state and local level, does it? Because that is the function of incorporation. Substantive due process is just the process where we get new rights, like the right to privacy that lives under the word liberty. Right? What about, in what case would you cite to support your answer with, you could pick any one, but there's one that should be obvious.
Pierce versus Society.
Probably cites Pierce versus Society of Sisters, since we already talked about that as the birth of the modern 14th Amendment in 1925. What's an older one that you could do from the 1880s? How is the court using the 14th Amendment and due process in a really creative, funny, and surprising way during the 1880s before we got to Pierce? They were using it to protect corporations. What kind of corporations often?
The railroad.
Railroads. And the railroad. So you could cite Santa Clara as a type of, as an example of the court using substantive due process. But in that case, to protect corporations. Right? We like Pierce better because it's about protecting people. And then if I said, what's the relationship between the Santa Clara case of 1886 and my brain just goes blank. The Santa Clara case of 1886 and the Bellotti case of 1976 or 78. One's on a 14th Amendment timeline, and the other one, very far away, is on the First Amendment timeline. What's the relationship between those two things? They both have to do with corporations.
Corporations.
Santa Clara created what?
They both have
Corporate
first and
person.
fourth.
Created corporate personhood, and Bellotti created what? What? Well, we already said that with Santa Clara. So under the 14th Amendment, we have corporate personhood. A corporation is going to be treated like a person. It's an if-then situation. If under the 14th Amendment, a corporation is going to be treated like a person, then under the First Amendment, what? They're going to have speech rights under the First Amendment. So we get corporate personhood leading directly to corporate speech.
So corporate personhood is for the Santa Clara case. and
Santa
not-
Clara creates corporate personhood. It just says that under the 14th Amendment, corporations are to be treated by people, like people. Then we get in Bellotti, the court said, well, if that's true, then that means they also have First Amendment speech rights as well. And on your stair-step chart, don't worry about our discussion about how the court extended corporate speech doctrine all the way through Citizens United as far as the exam. That was a good and interesting conversation to see how the law evolves over time. But for the exam, on your stair-step, where we get in the middle there, you've got you've got commercial speech, what case? Virginia Board, and corporate speech, which is Bellotti. That's all you need on your stair-step. So we said you want to be sure to study your stair-step charts. What else? The 8 values handout, there are 7 on it. We added one, protecting dissent. The First Amendment is a protection against mob rule. Even if 99.9%, we use as an example, even if 99.9% of Americans want to bomb Syria, if you are the 0.1% minority, the First Amendment protects your ability to get your voice heard. So the 8 values. PowerPoint slides. Class notes, obviously. And you could also divide your study into sections according to the units that we did. We did how law is made. That was the sources of law PowerPoints. And there's a blog post for how law is made. That was when we did the crash course in the founding era, right? What's the difference between the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution? Which came first? Articles. What's the difference between the two? What's the substantive difference between those two things?
They're both rights.
No Bill of Rights on the Articles of Confederation, that's true.
Constitution gives the government more, the federal government more power.
The Constitution gave the federal government more power, whereas the Articles of Confederation intentionally gave the federal government weak power. Right? You remember, we had this visualization of the structure. We had individuals down here. We had state governments here. And then we had the federal government here. And intentionally, we created a weak federal government and strong state governments because why? For what purpose? It's part of checks and balances. It's a way to keep a check on too much federal power and to protect what else? So that the state could act as a buffer between the federal government and the individuals. We were relying on the state governments to protect us from an overreaching monarchy, right? And then what other document much later fundamentally altered this arrangement? Think about it. Often called the Second Bill of Rights, the 14th Amendment, what year? 1868. It was part of how many amendments that we call the Reconstruction Amendments? 3. Which ones? 13, 14, 15. What did the 13th do? Abolish slavery. What did the 15th do? Gave blacks voting rights, and the 14th made them citizens. Gave them due process. How many clauses in the 14th Amendment? 3. There's another 3. What are they? The 3 clauses of the 14th Amendment. We've talked about one of them repeatedly already in this class. Privileges or immunities, due process, equal protection. What can you tell me about the privileges or immunities clause? It's closed down by what case? Slaughterhouse cases of 1873. It leaves us 2, due process and equal protection. When in 1868 the 14th Amendment was ratified, we call it the Second Bill of Rights. It fundamentally altered this arrangement in what visual way? How can we visualize it? You're taking good notes, it's in your notes.
The federal government draw an arrow and it goes in between the state government and the individual.
The federal government inserts itself right here between the state governments and the individuals. It takes on the protective role. Remember the words of Article 1 at the beginning, no state shall. No state shall abridge these rights. Due process. What else you got in your notes? What's autonomy theory an example of? And it gives us autonomy, and then it relates to the First Amendment value of each person should be allowed to be themselves, self-fulfillment, self-actualization, autonomy theory. That's an example of one of the values of free expression, and that's on that handout. Made power. Ms. Chess. Oh, I thought you were listening. What else should you study? The stair-step chart you obviously should study in great, great detail. Hint, hint.
What about the 4 major types of law, like that one chart we did?
So we have, you should definitely go back and study the sources of law PowerPoints that talk about the different types of law. We have 3 branches of government. All of them participate in making law, but they make different types of law. What type of law does Congress make? Yes, it's operating at the federal level. What kind of law I should rephrase that, not just Congress, but any legislatures, whether it's a state legislature or Congress.
Statutory?
Statutory law, right? What kind of law does the FTC or the FCC make? Administrative law, also known as regulatory law. And And then what type of law do the courts make?
Common law and constitutional law?
Common law and constitutional law. Is there any federal common law? No, because it was replaced by
Constitutional.
constitutional law. What else? Then we did our section where we, let's go back to the founding era as an example of when people say, well, what dates do we need to know? And I always just tell them, the dates that you need to know are the dates that you need to know.
All of them?
Well, I mean, as far as each individual case, not necessarily. It's not like I'm going to go through and take off points. But the dates that you need to know are the dates you should know as Americans, right? I mean, wouldn't you feel pretty stupid if you didn't know the significance of 1776? Everyone in here knows the significance of 1776, right?
I think you're doing my hair.
Declaration of Independence.
The Declaration of Independence, duh, right? And what else? What other important
The
documents?
state of constitution.
The state constitutions. All of the 13 original states all wrote constitutions in 1776, right? You can't be free dumb, right? So you need to rehearse those dates. You need to understand the progression from, and the, Mr. Winter, so if that was, the Declaration of Independence was the proximate cause for the Revolutionary War, then what? What are their dates? If we're gonna say it starts, then when does it end?
Constitution was ratified in 1789.
But when did the war end? It should be on your 1783 with what document?
Treaty of Paris.
Treaty of Paris. Right, so we should at least know some of this. I mean, a big part of what this class is about is not so much to teach you how to litigate a First Amendment case, because none of you are going to live, well, I don't know, some of you might, who knows, in the future. But it's so that you understand your heritage and the First Amendment and constitutional conditions that we have to stay really vigilant about protecting. Because who wants to take all of those rights away? The government, at every turn, every day, and in every way, they would like to curtail our constitutional rights. So we have to, first of all, know what they are, and second of all, stay vigilant and protect them. What else?
Do we have to put anything about the in that movie that we watched?
Well, obviously, you need to know Pentagon Papers case. That comes up with prior restraints. But no, I wouldn't take any question like from a movie, from a documentary, no. But just what we talk about in class, just our discussion, but not, I wouldn't like go and look at the movie and then draw a question out of it. Same thing with the March video. The March video is more about that writing assignment. And we're going to talk more about the Civil Rights era and how it changed constitutional law in a few weeks. What else? Any clarifications needed? If you suspect you haven't been taking really good notes, you definitely should hook up with a study partner, or even some of you could study together. Might be a good idea. I don't think so. I'm not in the mood. No, just, I think because there's so much material to cover anyway, I hate to burn up that many points on just one question. I'd rather have a bunch of questions with 6 points or 8 points and that kind of thing than burn up 20 points on just one question. There's going to be probably 25 multiple choice questions and the rest are answer questions with no lengthy essay questions. Just get to the point. I'm probing you for things just like we just talked about in class. There's no time and also no reason to compose, essays. It's about, well, regurgitating material.
So it's pretty much what we just did, except
Just
without
like,
notes.
yeah, it's just like that, but without notes, and that's why it's good to study with someone, because you can quiz each other. Who did flashcards? Anybody? Yeah, someone in this morning's class had a huge stack of flashcards. Who's got their flashcards with them? Let me see your flashcards, Ms. Conley.
These are all blank, but I have a,
Started. Kinds of things. First Amendment, 6 clauses of freedom. Articles of Confederation. Discovery of the truth is an example of. Discovery of the truth is an example of one of the 8 values of free expression. Discovery of the truth is associated with what catchphrase? Marketplace of Ideas, which comes to us from what author? Milton, and what work? Areopagitica, the subtitle of which is On the Liberty of Unlicensed Printing. Marketplace of Ideas first entered Supreme Court's constitutional law jurisprudence in what case? What famous case? What? Say it.
But that clause comes from the famous dissent in Abrams case.
Holmes's famous dissent in Abrams was the first time Marketplace of Ideas was used. That's 1919. It's one of the quartet of cases. In the quartet of cases, all of those cases pitted the government against an individual speaker. Who won all of those cases? The government. All of those cases were about, they were all socialists, including Eugene Debs, the popular presidential candidate. But they were all about what type of speech? Incitement. Incitement. And Schenck created a rule, the clear and present danger rule. That rule the court later thought was too weak, and so it superseded Schenck with what case? And it raised the bar.
It was Brandenburg.
Brandenburg v. Ohio, 1968. Participation in self-government is an example of one of the 8 values. Comes from the idea that it's a government for, of, and by the people. We can credit Alexander Meiklejohn. What does stable change refer to? Stable change. It's in the government's best interest to protest, also known as safety valve theory. You let people vent and get their frustrations out. Vince Blasey, we want the First Amendment to act to help facilitate a check on government power. It's the way that we watch and criticize what the government is doing. Tolerance. We let people go ahead and have their hateful speech because then there can be public condemnation or approbation.
Wait, so safety valve theory is what?
Safety valve theory comes to us from Spinoza. Safety valve theory says it's in the government's best interest to allow people to vent and get their anger out. Otherwise, we might end up with what? A violent revolution or overthrow of the government. So it's in the government's self-interest. And that's all, Mr. Hamlin, that's all on the handout. Promote innovation is my old First Amendment teacher, Jack Balkin. We want a free flow of ideas so that everybody can build on other ideas, and we have the most innovative tech industry. And then we added, if you didn't add this to your list, add this to your list, protecting dissent. Protecting dissent. It's the First Amendment is our protection against mob rule. You can cite Schifrin for that possibility. And now I'm back. Common law was one of the 4 types of law or sources of law. It's made by judges. Common law is law that accrues over time through judicial decisions. Case law, we study case law to find out how the law changes over time. What does stare decisis mean?
Stand by the decision.
Stand by the decision. It gets to the idea that the court doesn't want to dramatically change the law all at one time. Who was John Marshall? No, he wasn't the first Chief Justice. He wasn't the first Chief Justice, but
And he was a chief justice.
yes, he was. He was the first really important Chief Justice.
Increase the power of the Supreme Court.
Increase the power of the Supreme Court through, for example, creation of the concept of judicial review in Marbury v. Madison. What does habeas corpus mean? What?
Innocent until proven guilty?
It's part of that idea, package of ideas.
Isn't it serving body?
Hold the body.
Yeah.
Hold the body, meaning I want to, all of us have a right to be in control of our own body. And if the government is going to take control of our body away from us by putting us in prison or killing us, then Mr. Higgins, you're exactly right. We have a right to be charged, we have a right to due process, we have a right to face our accuser, we have a right. We talked about articles, we talked about the Treaty of Paris. Good. What else? What else do you think we should study? What else? Any questions or clarification? So you're up and running, but you just are not at a point of having it off the top of your head yet. But you will.
Does Kara have like set hours that she's?
She doesn't, and I was gonna, I had the idea of, yeah, and she and I just exchanged emails. She's real swamped with classes tomorrow during the day, because I was gonna ask her to meet with my Tuesday class, but she's in class all like that. So I just told her that y'all would send her an email if you have questions or you want to talk through something or that kind of thing. And what,
Do you remember her email? No, I just,
let me jot that down.
It's Read C10.
Read C10. And you know the rest. So that's Kara. And of course, I'll be on email, right? You can always feel free to shoot me a question by email if like you run into a snag while you're studying and you don't remember something or don't understand something. Do you want me to make all of the videos public? I have a YouTube channel up and running. It's got all the videos from every week of class. Yeah, I'll send it to you in an email so it'll be in your inbox. And then they're all labeled like week 2, part 1, part 2, part 3, you know, and it's kind of goofy, right? They look really goofy. But they're there. So especially like if anybody was absent, like look for those Fridays where lots of you were absent, like this past Friday. So look for like whatever the last video for each week is, will probably be that Friday class. So, because for example, all of y'all who missed this past Friday, that ended up being a really good class. We really covered prior restraint in a really thorough, step-by-step way. So you might want to watch that video. So when I get home later this afternoon, I'll send y'all an email, and I'll have the link to the YouTube channel. Any other questions? Are you going to share those timelines? Do you mind? Do y'all want her timelines?
yeah.
The fancy timeline?
Yes.
Awesome. Good. Well, I didn't want to present any new material or anything today, and if y'all don't have any questions or other things you want to bat about, then we could just break early.
Want me to stop the video?